Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 16 of the Movement as Medicine podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Carr, joined by my amazing co-host coming to me from California at about 5:40 in the morning, Brendan Rarick. Good morning to you.
Good morning. We were supposed to start at 5, but I had a little late start today.
He's a sleepy boy today.
I was a very sleepy man.
It's all right. I took my dogs for a walk. You gave me time to do the things I needed to do.
I'm jealous.
So
that's what I'm going to have to do all that after. What are you up to this weekend?
It's good to see you. I just hopefully having a baby. That's what we're hoping for. Ariel is upstairs, just bouncing up and down on a stability ball because apparently that's supposed to help. But she's going to do anything that they tell her to do at this point if it helps get the baby out. So we took a walk. I think we're going to go work out. Hopefully that gets things moving a little bit. But so I'm just kind of on call. But I've done a lot of things around my house. We painted the basement. I got some furniture delivered. I have a lot of long task list today that I need to complete after this. So it's good that we're starting early. And hopefully at some point I'll have to go to the hospital to get the baby out. So let's keep our fingers crossed for that one.
Well, good luck with that. I'll be on call.
How about
as
yourself?
I'm gonna go do all the things that you did this morning. After this, I gotta walk the dog. I've got a football meeting today before we start summer tomorrow, Monday morning or Monday afternoon. So we're gonna work on our organization and how that's going to work. They're ripping up the turf at the high school right now, so we have to work out on a grass field without any lines or anything. So
they're replacing
it. Yeah, they're replacing it, and apparently it's going to take less than 4 weeks, but I don't believe that. So I'm preparing as if we won't. Yeah, I'm preparing as if we won't have access to the turf for the season.
Probably a good idea.
Preseason. And then I got my good friend Charlie coming over, Charlie Reed, for his birthday. We're going to grill some steaks, and Jenny is away for work.
Just being men in the backyard, grilling some steaks, drinking beer.
Yeah, swimming in the
Unbelievable.
pool. Yeah. So,
life is good.
Yeah, tough day. So.
Well, we have another AMA episode that we asked for questions. I had some questions sent in, and we picked two that seem to be good topics that we think we could cover for an hour. And as I'm saying that, again, if you're listening to this and you want to send questions in, DM them to us, email them to us, because we're happy to go through them. It gives us listener-guided content, which is really what we want, to talk about the things that you want to hear about. And typically you guys send in some pretty good questions. So this first one is from Peter Smeets. Shout out to Peter over in Switzerland, former MBSC intern, actually interned with me way back in the day. In 2008. And his question, I'll read it here, says he has a couple clients with Parkinson's and clients over the age of 80. And as you know, lots of doctors might not be on board with the proactive exercise approach to dealing with, age-related cognitive decline or Parkinson's-related cognitive and movement-related decline. And he wants to know if there were any references or resources we could share with him to help him better talk to the doctor and get them on board and just better guide his programming. And so kind of how can we dive into the impact that exercise can have on some of these neurodegenerative diseases, whether it be things like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or MS or just general cognitive decline as you age. What is some of the research that's out there, and how can we support him so he can better support his clients?
Yeah, from a resource standpoint, I immediately go to Neuroplasticity and the book The Way the Brain Changes Itself by Norman Deutsch. I can't even remember when I first read that. The idea of neuroplasticity being that basically that the brain can still function even if something should go wrong or something stops working, because there's so much overlap in the brain. And there's just so many examples of that. And then I'm going to read this here. It's directly from the way the brain changes itself. When they mapped the subject's brain, scientists discovered that just doing mental practice resulted in the same changes in their motor systems as the ones who actually practice. So that's one thing I'd like to talk about is visualization. The other thing is through specific areas are responsible for specific roles in the brain, many often overlap and help one another. So that's where movement as medicine comes into play. I'm not naive enough to think, though, that movement is the only thing that helps with this overlap. So I'd like to discuss a little bit further there as well. So those are the two things that come to mind for me. One, the resource, the way the brain changes itself, and what are the things we can do to help with the neuroplasticity as we age. And I know you did a whole presentation on this, I believe, called Movement as Medicine. And crazy enough. And then I've been diving a lot into visualization myself because I'm going to use it with the football team this season. So
nice. Well, the big thing with any of these neurodegenerative diseases or aging related diseases is what we need to do is the reason exercise is valuable is like you said, the neurotropic factors. When you exercise, you get more blood flow, more oxygenation in the cells. You get releases of things like BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic growth factor, that helps stimulate growth cells and cells in the brain. And specifically in Parkinson's, it's a disease of dopamine, right? It's a lack of dopamine that keeps them from being able to move or has them move in that shuffling gait that you often see. And one of the values of exercise is that it stimulates dopamine synthesis in the brain. And so that's why we see changes in symptoms following exercise. And so what I was going to send over to Peter was a link to an article that I found, which is a research review, I think it was 2010, of all of the studies surrounding exercise as it relates to Parkinson's progression and Parkinson's symptoms. And what they found was, I mean, we don't have a cure for Parkinson's, but they looked at it from a lens of improving quality of life, improving physical functioning day to day, being able to do regular everyday tasks, improvements in their gait, both in their stride length, in their amount of their power and their push off, and lack of shuffling, because that's like one of the big hallmarks of the disease, obviously, impact on their strength as well as their balance and risk of falls. Because ultimately what you're looking to do is increase their quality of life or slow down progression of symptoms, at least where we are right now as far as managing disease. And it is all pretty positive. I will say all the studies were pretty short in duration. So it would probably be beneficial to have studies that are done over longer periods of time. I think like the longest one was like a 12-week intervention. So you might be able to see some results there, but I think ultimately training them over the course of years is you're probably going to see a larger impact, or be able to see potential for a larger impact if you do it for a longer period of time. The sample sizes were also fairly low. And in some of the cases, the intensity was really low. It was like seated chair stretching, which you wouldn't expect there to be much of an impact there. But however, in the ones that were strength training related, or in aerobic exercise related, things where people were up on their feet, they all did have positive impacts on their daily physical functioning, their stride length and stride power, their strength and their balance. So we know pretty clearly that exercise has a positive effect due to exactly what you said, the neuroplasticity. When people exercise, there's more oxygenation, more blood flow. It promotes new nerve growth and survival, almost more importantly. Like we talk about the idea of as we get older, we're training for power, and we might not actually be getting that much more powerful or stronger, but we're not getting worse. And when you're looking at people later in life who might have a neurodegenerative disease, that means quality of life for them for a longer period of time. And so the research is pretty clear there. And so I'll link to that systematic review in the show notes. It's really pretty interesting. But if you're not into reading studies, The Brain That Changes of Itself, as Brendan mentioned, really interesting book that goes into.
I'm sorry. I'm laughing because I knew you would go into the science of everything.
Yeah.
And that I was not going to go into the science of everything, like the BDNF. And,
Yeah.
But just the way you said, if you're not into science, aka Brendan, then you can read this book.
It's very good. He's a great writer. And he tells a bunch of little different stories to demonstrate all the different points that he talks about, right? About the value of neuroplasticity and how people, when you think that they might be stuck with a certain condition or whatnot, how they can adapt. The same with, I know, the other book that you wanted to discuss as well.
Yeah, The Tale of Dueling Neurosurgeons by Sam Kahn. I believe it was Michael Mullen who recommended this book to us.
My brother gave me that
book. Oh, maybe it was Michael then.
Yeah.
The early studies of the human brain used a simple method. Wait for misfortune to strike, strokes, seizures, infectious diseases, horrendous accidents, and see how the victims coped. So that's originally how they figured out most of our medical stuff, was basically someone got it, they wrote down the symptoms and what happened, and then they thought, oh, well, that must be, the cause, but that must be the part of the brain that's affected. So they always bring up the Atticus Finch, who got the steel rod through his brain and it took out his frontal lobe. He's still alive.
Phineas Gage,
seemingly perfectly fine.
Phineas Gage.
What's Atticus? What's Atticus Finch then?
Oh my God,
that's from a book.
Phineas Gage.
Phineas Gage. Whatever. Fancy names. Atticus Finch. Now this is going to be funny. It's going to be like To Kill a Mockingbird or something.
No, Atticus Finch is from To Kill a Mockingbird. You are correct.
Okay. See? All right. Well, I'm not that dumb then. So they use that example. Hold on. Observers were amazed by the transformations that took place when different parts of the brain were destroyed, altering victims' personalities. Parents suddenly couldn't recognize their own children. Pillars of the community became pathological liars. Some people couldn't speak, but they could still sing. And so they go through all these fascinating stories, phantom limbs, blind people who could see through their tongues. The book starts with the king of France in a jousting match. He gets jousted in the head and it messes up. He essentially gets a concussion, but they didn't know what that was back then, and it changes his entire personality. So that is also a fascinating book that, again, goes down the road of neuroplasticity, which is a fancy way of saying, like, how do we connect dots? And there's certain things we can do to connect more dots in our brains, especially if something should go wrong. So, for example, the blind people who figure out how to use their tongue and their ears, right, their other sensory organs adapt, and they can use those to see, or essentially they make echolocation like a bat, and they can hear the distances away that they are from a wall or from whatever it is by using their tongue to make sounds, which is fascinating that the brain could learn how to do that. But you and I would never, probably never be able to, because the brain essentially rewires itself to continue living. And like you said, I think the word is survival. That's essentially what the brain is always thinking, like, how can I survive? And exercise, to tie this all back in exercise is a nice low level, graded, controlled exposure to survival. So when we're in the gym and we're challenging people with these disabilities or diseases, we effectively are changing their brain by making more connections, and hopeful that carries over to a longer, maybe not a longer life, but a what do they call it? Disability years. Yeah,
you're shortening your time spent in disability. And so it's always the idea of lifespan versus age versus health span, right? So we're trying to increase their overall health span. And with exercise, what you essentially do is you create an environment for the brain to be optimized. right? Put aside the fact that there's a neurodegenerative disease breaking these individuals down over time. Now, there's obviously therapeutics and drugs that they're working on to help slow or reverse the breakdown that happens with the disease, right? But aside from that, these individuals probably already don't have an ideal biochemical or physiological environment for their brain to be optimized, even if they didn't have the disease, as probably you or I or anybody else. But by exercising,
you mean modernity? You mean sitting at my computer in a small office all day isn't good for my brain?
Exactly. And so by exercising, you promote blood flow and oxygen, which helps the proliferation of growth of nerve cells. BDNF released helps the proliferation of nerve cells. Dopamine helps your motor system work smoothly. Like, we need dopamine to do any movements, right? That's what our chemical is. It allows us to move. And then also the exercise helps from Parkinsons specifically. That's like a movement related disorder, helps the central processing in our nervous system to create force and move. And all that stuff tends to degrade with the disease, but it also just degrades with aging. And so, I mean, it makes a lot of sense that exercise would help these individuals. I just think from a medical standpoint, kind of what Peter was asking was like, how do I get a doctor to buy in and think that this is valuable? Right? Because I think for them, they think like, oh, these people can't exercise, right? Like, they can barely move. They shuffle their way into my office. And so the challenge is often application, right? Like, have you ever worked with someone with Parkinson's? It could be very challenging to find ways to get them moving, right? Depending on how advanced they are along the spectrum. In doing things that look like exercise. It's obviously not going to look like the same way that you train your normal, healthy, everyday individual, right? You're going to have to make a lot of modifications, but it could be loaded walking. It could be just doing everything in one place, standing up, sitting down, using a TRX, putting on a weight vest if they have trouble holding the weights, things like that. But it doesn't have to be your traditional strength training program or how you train everybody, but there's definitely a room for application in doing it, because what we just want is the physiological response where the heart rate goes up, the muscles are starting to work and contract, and we're creating the physiological environment on the inside that helps them adapt a little bit better and stave off the disease maybe a little bit longer, right?
So I'm very comfortable with taking on the doctor question. I've been consulting at a healthcare company for the last 4 years, where it's an interdisciplinary system where we work with the physicians, the nurses. We have the physical medicine team, which is our PT, chiro, acu, massage, and fitness. And then we have our behavioral health, which is psychology wing of everything. And I'll just say this about doctors. So if we put on our doctor hat and we look at from their perspective, is doctors are going to be very, very risk adverse. They don't want to tell anybody anything that could then fall back upon them. Exactly. Also, think of it from a doctor's perspective. You've got this person who has a shuffling gait, who is very susceptible to falling and being injured, and then think about what a doctor sees as fitness. Okay, so you've got your CrossFits, you've got your health clubs, that's what the doctor is envisioning when they prescribe fitness to somebody with Parkinson's or somebody with poor movement patterns or someone who's obese or someone like. They're going to say, yeah, probably shouldn't do CrossFit. Probably shouldn't go to the health club and run on a treadmill. Like, they're not envisioning Peter. They're not envisioning you or I. Whereas, because essentially we're doing more physical therapy, right? More movement than we are doing actual fitness training, right? Fitness is all relative. I get that, but doctors don't get that fitness is all relative. Like, they've got to protect themselves. They've got to protect you, right? So they're very risk adverse there. They're going to be very conservative. And their idea of fitness is not like what we know it to be, right? So we probably get lumped into the functional trainer bucket, which is fine with me. But the doctor's not thinking of a functional trainer. So if somehow you can make that connection with the doctor, and I mean, I know we're willing to talk to the doctor. It's the doctor that has to be willing to talk to you, because the doctor's the one who generally has less time. There's less ways to get in contact with them. There's usually only one, which is through some sort of administrator. So really, you have to get the patient or the client to take that baton, because they're your number one intel or resource to get to the doctor, right?
That's true.
So the individual has to take their own health into their own hands at this point, and either force the doctor to speak with you, the fitness professional, and make that connection somehow, or they need to find a new doctor, or you've got to just understand that the doctor's going to be very risk adverse for multiple reasons, and that the doctor might not know who you are and what you do and why you do it. And they're just going to lump you in with every other fitness trainer. And this is the problem with fitness is we get lumped in, right, with the bad trainers. The good trainers get lumped in with the bad trainers. And what do you mostly see on the internet is the dumb shit that people do. So you then get associated with that. And because we don't have licensure in fitness, which is a great thing, and it's a horrible thing.
Yeah.
Right.
So double-edged sword.
No double-edged sword, no barriers for entry. Awesome. Like, anybody who has a passion for fitness and wants to be great at it can get into it. Horrible thing is that anybody with a passion who doesn't know anything can also get into fitness and prescribe exercises and workouts, and that's a scary thing. So, because there's no licensure, right? Like, we made up our own certification because we can. There's nobody who told us that we can't. So, like, you've got to try to do your best to reach out to the doctor, just understand where they're coming from. So be a little bit empathetic there. And then your client has to be the driver, because you reaching out to the doctor 99 out of 100 times isn't going to elicit a response from the doctor. It's got to come from the patient.
Oh, yeah.
When the patient demands it from the doctor, then most likely it will happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's my take on the doctor thing, is like, essentially you got to sell yourself almost as a physical therapist. You're not necessarily, you're not trying to break records with this person. You're not going to run any 5Ks. You're not going to enter any powerlifting meets. But that's what the doctor is envisioning when they hear fitness and exercise. They've got this preconceived idea of what the media thinks those things are. It's like those memes that you see all the time, like, what my parents think I do, what my parents think I do, what the doctor thinks I do, what my friends think I do, and what I actually do. But that's true. That's exactly, the doctor has an idea of what you're going to do to this person, that you're going to put a barbell in their hands and have them snatch it over their head and they have Parkinson's. That's right. So you've got to be aware of that. And that hasn't changed, because the doctors are mostly worried about sick care. Honestly, they don't spend their time on preventative care because they have so many people who are sick. And that's part of why we're in this system and why the system is broken, but it's the system right now. So we've got to play nice. So that's my take on the doctor thing.
And so I think in summary, the biggest thing is, like, we know exercise is going to be good. I think the challenge for anybody out there who's going to be working with people who might have any neurodegenerative disease is, like we said, application. Like you said, it probably isn't going to look like your traditional training at the beginning. Might look like, hey, come in, we're going to walk with a weight vest, and then we're going to do some TRX squats and use the cable machine and try to walk through the ladder and just try to keep you moving so your heart rate gets up, right? Like, just create circuits with tasks, functionally related tasks for them. And
that are in a controlled environment that, right? It's in a controlled environment that has support all around. right? And then like, you're hopeful that those connections get made in the gym in a safe place that they can then carry that over into real life that doesn't have as many constraints or as much an environment that is always changing, right?
Yes.
That's the thing, is we want to start slow and prepare them for an environment that's always going to be changing in real life. But in the gym, I have a lot more control.
Yes. And what you can do is, like, if you can find ways to do those tasks and still get a heart rate impact with people, then that's pretty amazing, right? Like they're getting a little bit stronger, right. They're getting their heart rate up, which is going to be hard for people who don't move very well. And so whatever things you can bring up. I actually want to look at this. Where's this Rhonda Patrick research? My favorite person. She just posted.
You retweet her daily.
It's because she's so much smarter than me. But she posted this study that I actually haven't read yet, but I just bookmarked it. But I'll just read her caption because it was really good, because it actually kind of speaks towards the neuroplasticity and brain health and exercise piece. So this exercise intensity may determine which brain regions are affected during a workout. So different intensities affect different parts of the brain. So low intensity exercise activated brain regions involved in cognition and attention, while high intensity exercise activated brain regions involved in mood and emotion and dampen motor function brain networks. So both intensities improve mood. And so thinking about the impact that your brain can have on the entire system is like, I'll keep reading. It says, low intensity aerobic exercise was at about 50% of a person's max heart rate, while high intensity exercise was at about 75% or higher. And the mechanisms for differential brain effects include neurochemicals like lactate and cortisol and neurotrophins and neurotransmitters all affect how these regions all work. And so thinking about, okay, if I'm going to have them, you're probably only going to be able to do low intensity stuff with people early on. But if you can keep them moving, when we know it changes people's memory and attention and motor processing. So just getting them moving, it doesn't really matter. I don't think what it is that you do, as long as you find things they can do comfortably without pain. And like you said, in a controlled environment, and hopefully it has a snowballing effect for people who, you also have to realize that if they have a disease and they have symptoms, there's also just probably some degradation of their abilities because they've stopped doing things, right? So it's like, how much of it is it from the actual disease, and how much of it is from disuse because they were diagnosed with Parkinson's or whatever it might be. And so if you get them moving, you might find that some of those symptoms will actually get a lot better just because they start doing things again. Not to say that it will negate the disease entirely. It certainly wouldn't, but it would definitely make them more active and more probably resilience to stress because they're staying active in the first place.
Well, if you think of it as, right, they have 100% loss of whatever, right? If 50% of that is from the disease itself, that's not going to change. And then there's 50% of that's due to disuse. That we can certainly change from a movement perspective. And that 50% can actually change now with the medications that they have and the electrostim that they have. Like, they can insert things into your brain now, into your spinal cord, that can actually help with movement. And then there's medicines that you can actually take now for these things that stop the tremors, that stop the so like there's the 50% that's the doctor's wheelhouse. Right? I have nothing to do with that. But the 50% of the disuse we can definitely work on. So imagine, so that say they're 100% disabled from whatever it is, but 50% of that is medical and 50% of that is due to disuse. And we can make a 30% improvement in usage, and then they can make a 30% usage improvement in medicine. That's a 60% improvement with that individual just from moving and then taking the correct medications, or because of modern medicine. I mean, I'm not naive enough, as you said, to think that like if we just start putting on weight vests and walking around and throwing and catching tennis balls and stuff, that magically you're going to be cured. That just modern medicine is there for a reason, and it's incredible. So I wrote in coaching rules that there's 5 things for me. So there's movement as medicine, there's food as thy medicine, there's nature as thy medicine, there's water as thy medicine, and then there's medicine as my medicine as thy medicine. So
regular old Hippocrates over here.
I'm the modern Hippocrates. Hippocrates didn't have access to all the information that we have. But at the end of the day, like, there's medicine is a wonderful thing. Like, penicillin has saved millions of lives. Mm-hmm. I'm going to take the penicillin if I need an antibiotic. I'm not going to be like, oh, I'm just going to, walk it off. That's not how it works. So, there's a lot of people. I'm only here doing this podcast because of modern medicine.
This is
that's
true.
A whole story in itself. Right. But I wasn't going to exercise my way out of aplastic anemia. It's just I needed modern medicine to get over the hump.
We should actually do a whole podcast on that, to be honest. I'm going to interview you.
I know. Okay, that'll be interesting. I got to find something to interview you about. You're boring, though.
No, I didn't. I haven't had any near-death experiences to speak of.
Maybe we can go back to your BMX snowboarding childhood.
Exactly.
This brings another book, since I'm not the researcher here, and I hate studies. Spark.
Oh yeah,
the book Spark by John Rady goes into how exercise, and they specifically use aerobic exercise, primes the brain for learning. And I would love if they did a study that did a combination of strength training with different movement patterns and aerobic exercise. That would be cool to see if there's a difference between a control group, an aerobic group, and a strength training group in learning capacity. But that's another great book on how, and that one really gets into BDNF and how exercise affects the brain and the ability to learn, and again, the ability to connect dots. So Spark is another great resource if anyone is interested in how exercise affects learning in the brain.
Very good.
2 things I want to mention are visualization and meditation. Those 2 things have been studied, and every book that I read on neuroplasticity and trying to change the brain dive into imagery, visualization, and meditation as their non-movement ways to elicit a similar response that you get from exercise. So therefore, okay, so exercise is great. So maybe that gets our 30%, but maybe the last 20% of use is them just visualizing it, or meditating, or whatever you want to call it. I don't care what that is, but actively having to use your brain, even in a steady state or in a lying state where you're not moving at all, can make those connections in the gray matter.
Mirror neurons.
And release mirror neurons. And it elicits a hormonal response. So say this person's so tired from the exercise and they can only get in to see you 2 to 3 days a week. That means the other 4 or 5 days a week, they could be just doing imagery drills or visualization drills or meditating, whatever that looks like to you. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that everything that I've read on neuroplasticity, again, it's not just about movement. It's not just about medicine and what those 2 things can do. You can also take the cognitive and mental drills or mental skills and use those to improve outcomes for people with Parkinson's or other diseases.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah,
So
mirror neurons are fascinating.
Yeah, at the very least, if you can't get in the gym, have some
just think about getting in the gym.
Or some meditation. Think about it.
That's what you're going to do today, Brendan. You're going to sit by the pool.
Yeah,
You're gonna drink beers, but you're gonna think about exercising.
See, this is why there has to be more thy medicines, because you can't just focus on one and expect it to fix all the others. Like, it's a combination of everything. But it would be phenomenal if I could sit at the pool and think about working out while drinking a beer and have myself lose a couple extra pounds. that I know is not to be true.
Oh my God.
So.
Well, that was really good. And we have a second question from Matt. Matt sent in a question. He said, what are your key considerations when training endurance athletes? I'm specifically interested in learning about how you approach both strength and conditioning for clients who are preparing for long distance running events like a marathon. And I think we've talked about this briefly before. And I know you and I have both trained a lot of endurance athletes, both runners, cyclists, swimmers, triathletes, things of that nature. And it's a question we get a lot about how to build a plan for someone whose sport might inherently be an exercise, like running, and something that they do at very high volumes. So how do you create a program that can accommodate all the rest of the training that they need to do and still provide a positive benefit, especially when those individuals, endurance athletes specifically, might be somewhat resistant or skeptical of the value of something like strength training?
So I'm drawing out little buckets here.
Oh, you love buckets.
I know, Mike. Ever since I've heard Mike talk about it, the idea of buckets, right? Because there's no studies on buckets, so I like the visualization of it. So as you mentioned, I've also had the opportunity to train professional triathletes and just regular old triathletes who look up to their professionals. Definitely not professional triathletes, though. So I worked with a triathlete coach. His name's Matt Dixon, and he looked at triathlon and from 4 different buckets. So the 4 different buckets are there's a run, bike, swim bucket, right? So run, bike, swim, that's his bucket. That's not my bucket. I don't coach run, bike, swim. I coach everything that goes into being able to run, bike, and swim to move better and be more resilient. That's what I'm doing as a strength coach. There's the recovery bucket. So this is your nutrition and sleep. There's the strength bucket. So that's my wheelhouse, our wheelhouse. And then there's the mental bucket, right? So that's the mental conditioning, all that. So maybe we dabble in the mental bucket, but they have legitimate like mental health coaches that they work with, or sports psychologists, right? Which is funny to me. I'm just going to get on my soapbox for a second, is that when it's a sports psychologist, it's totally cool. But when it's a psychologist where I'm talking about my feelings and the shit that's going on in my life, it's considered taboo, right? But if it's a sports psychologist, it's totally okay. So, just my little soapbox.
Well, that's a bigger overall conversation, because again, we condone behavior in sports that we wouldn't condone anywhere else.
Yes.
Right? Like
big problem.
Shows of emotion. Like if after I did anything at work and I danced like Steph Curry, after I did anything successful, people would be like, can you stop doing that?
Or if I broke into tears because I was so happy, that would be not cool. But in sports, it's totally allowed. That's a big problem. And if anyone's watched the NFL in the last 10 years, there's things that they get away with that aren't cool and need to be addressed. Okay, I'm getting off my soapbox now. Okay, so the 3 buckets are run, bike, swim, recovery, strength, and mental training. So the strength bucket is ours. Now, for me, the strength bucket breaks into 4 different things. So we have mobility, all right? We have strength, we have power, and we have conditioning. Okay, so the conditioning bucket is so full and overflowing. My goal is to actually rein it in and try to keep the bucket from overspilling, because there's so much run, bike, and swim going on with triathlon that the conditioning, the aerobic bucket, is just it's taken care of. So I'm going to spend all of my time on the mobility, strength, and power buckets for anybody who's an endurance athlete. So, for example, even if it's somebody who's, we'll choose trying to run a marathon, their running days and their running mileage is already set. So at the beginning, you're running, 7 miles on Monday, 8 miles on Wednesday, 9 miles on Friday, and then you just keep progressing as you get closer to the event. So my job isn't, I could help with the navigation of the sets and reps and numbers and time and distance. But that's, again, not necessarily my wheelhouse. So I'm going to assess the athlete and say, like, okay, your mobility is good or bad, or where can we, do you need more ankle mobility? Do you need more hip mobility? Do you need more shoulder? Do you need more of XYZ? Then we're going to assess their strength. Like, are you strong enough to absorb the forces of running? So in a marathon, I have no idea how many steps you'll take. I'm guessing it's a lot, but you have to absorb those thousands and thousands of steps over a very long period of time. So strength is essentially your ability to eccentrically load or absorb force. Then it's going to be power. So the more powerful you are, the more force you can absorb over a long period of time, which means you can be more efficient. So instead of breaking down at mile 5, you break down at mile 13. Now, that's a huge, significant difference, even though the last 10 miles are still going to suck. There's no doubt, like, at some point, the body's going to start to break down. If you're an average person,
you just want to break down better than the other people.
You want to break down better and later.
Yeah,
that's the goal. As a normal average person, I love the Bill Murray quote that he wishes in the Olympics that there was always just an average person that was racing for reference points, because everyone's like, man, like, I could have totally beat her in the pool or beat him. It's like, no, you wouldn't even come close to beating the last place person.
Yes,
you'd still be in the shallow end trying to catch your breath.
Exactly.
So yeah, my big buckets are mobility, strength, power, and then based off of the individual, which do we need more of? And I'm always thinking of it from the standpoint of what's going to allow you to run, bike, and swim more, and what's going to help you be more efficient and last longer, or like you said, break down better than everybody else. So everybody's going to break down at some point, but can you push that as far as you can? It's exactly what we spoke about with the longevity, disability years versus health years, right? So I want a very steep decline at the end. I want to go real quick. I don't want to suffer for 20, 30, 40 years with a disability. I want to go fast and hard at the very end. And so it's the same thing with a long endurance event. So that's how I think of training from a strength standpoint. If you want to get more into the endurance stuff, you're probably more well versed in that than I am, especially with the conditioning and mileage and stuff like that. But I'm just going to have them record their mileage, their distances, and the Strava app is really, really good for this, because it'll take your GPS and then calculate your mileage each week and how much you ran. And then if we can get foot contacts can be an important thing to monitor, because if you do, 20,000 foot contacts one week and the next week you do 50, maybe we want to go 20 the next week, or maybe that's what led to your stress fracture in your foot.
Exactly.
The stress. I've had triathletes work out so much they get stress fractures in their femurs. Right. That's right. That I think you've had that as well. Like that's yes. I'm thinking I know exactly who she is. She's the principal at a school. She ran so much she got a stress fracture, and then I had a professional triathlete do the same thing. She ran so much she got a stress fracture in her femur. which we all know the femur is the hardest bone in your body to break. It's literally made of concrete, and somehow they broke it from running too much.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm thinking of when I'm training somebody for endurance.
Yeah, and the big thing, like you touched on it, I think so I'll start the big picture and kind of zoom in a little bit. In that, like, if it's a professional or kind of amateur professional who has a coach, let them manage the endurance programming. They're probably better at it than you are, or at least develop a relationship with them so you can have conversations. So those people who I've had that have had coaches, I've been like, hey, this is what we're doing. I'd like to see what you're doing. Hopefully they have a sensible approach to programming. Like you said, small jumps. Realistically, when you look at the data, people who run over 40 miles a week have significantly higher amount of injuries than people who run under 40 miles a week. Now, that doesn't mean that some people can't take really high volumes. Everybody is different. And I've seen runners who run almost the same times. They're all very fast. They're on like sub 3 hour marathoners, some who respond really well to high volume and some who don't. So it's just like strength training in that, like, some people respond to volume and some people don't. So you have to figure out the individual first off and figure out the coach, whoever that person is. And so you develop communication. If you're with someone who doesn't, then it might be sensible to help guide them to build a plan, because the biggest reason why people get hurt running is because they just start running. And that's the kind of the problem, the double-edged sword of running is that it's great in that there's a low barrier for entry for people who might not have access to a gym, who might not know how to strength train. They just need to put shoes on and go outside. And so that's why it's popular and why it's valuable, but it's also the problem because they just start running with no sense of how much and how fast, how long. And so getting them to like think, the 10% rule works really well early. As you go on, it might not work quite as well. You might need to be slower. Jason Fitzgerald from Strength Running, who I did a podcast with on this exact topic, has some really good kind of articles because he's an endurance athlete, but he has taken a interest in strength training and functional training and whatnot. And he talks a lot about this. And I use some of his resources to help write an article on strengthcoach.com about functional training, strength training, and power training for runners as well. So check both his website, Strength Running Out, and then strengthcoach.com. I have an article.
Put them in the show notes.
Absolutely. And you want to make sure you're taking slow, consistent jumps. When you start making large jumps, just like you would in the weight room, you start to have problems with volume or workload adaptation. And then it's important to realize in the weight room that it doesn't take a lot. Like, it's a very potent stimulus, and we're not trying to turn them into football players or hockey players or power lifters. So they probably only need to lift 2 days a week, and they don't need a lot of volume because they're already getting a ton of volume outside of there. And so, like you said, the buckets, right? The things that we can really focus on, movement quality, right? If we make sure that their joints move better and absorb and adapt to the stress that they get during running, they're not going to break down as quickly. They're going to be healthier over the long term of their career as well as just in the short term when they're exercising. From a power standpoint, both, like you said, eccentrically and concentrically, we know there's a ton of research around running economy as it relates to plyometrics and strength training. And running economy, like you said, meaning the people can run at the same intensity as far as their speed goes with less oxygen usage, right? And so Brendan and I were running same exact speed. We're the same person, except I've been doing my plyos, and Brendan hasn't.
I knew you were going to be the one to beat me. Now I never get to win.
See, I'm along
always
here.
Left in the dust.
And Brendan has been doing his plyos. So I'm more economical in my running and gait than him. So over time, I'm able to harness elastic energy better because I have greater tendon stiffness in my Achilles, my foot, my lower leg to absorb the force without the cost of having to do a muscular contraction, right? If you have greater tendon stiffness, doesn't mean the joint's immobile. It just means the tendon gets stiffer. Then it's like having those. It's like the Paralympic runners with the spring legs. that they get some spring from those. That's why they wanted to control how they design those things. You get a greater spring through your Achilles and your foot. And then from a strength training standpoint, one, tendon stiffness, same thing, but also, like you said, just their ability to absorb and produce force concentrically as well is going to help them, like you said, break down later. And it really only needs to be, in my experience, we lift 2 days a week and we just move it around based on the volumes of their running. And then we might taper it a little bit as we get closer to their competition. But you don't want to try to start to have them train 4 days a week, 5 days a week, because you're going to start to take away from the adaptations they need. That bucket, the endurance bucket, should stay full. It shouldn't overflow, right? And the strength training bucket should be a little smaller, but we want to make sure that we're filling it. Usually it's empty. And so find ways to get it in. It's just like thinking about in-season lifting, right? Endurance athletes are like always in-season athletes. They don't take very often. They don't really take much of an off season because, at least the amateur ones, because they just do it because they enjoy it. And you're dealing with usually very type A individuals who want to continue to do more. And so again, by developing a relationship with their coach, or if they don't have a coach, developing a relationship with them, it'll encourage them to listen to you a little bit more. So maybe you can get them to roll back their volume a little bit, and you can get them to dedicate maybe 1 or 2 days to strength training as opposed to having to run every single day or bike every day or swim every day. And so little bits of plyometrics and power work. Power work is something you can keep in really well. If you think about the adaptations, you'll lose those nervous system gains and those explosive power gains pretty quickly if you don't do them regularly. And so just keeping a little bit of power work in right up until the competition, that's typically not going to fatigue them. It's the heavier strength training that might fatigue them. It's going to keep the running economy, keep the tendon stiffness, keep them healthy. Then as you get close to the competition, trend down the strength work a little bit more, and you'll probably be in pretty good shape, so long as they don't have any other things, that injuries and whatnot that they're dealing with, which they probably will be if they've been running that much.
Yeah, when I work with the football team, I, like you said, the in season, I don't damper down the plyometric stuff. Even the day before the game, I want them to be springing and neurologically primed for the next day, but I do decrease the strength training dramatically. So we do a bunch of mobility stuff with a bunch of high neurological stuff, like hang cleans or pogos or stuff like that. I will make mention, so about the buckets, is each individual and each sport has a different sized bucket, right? So everybody has the 4 buckets. So there's the mobility, strength, power, and conditioning buckets. Now, if you're an endurance athlete, that conditioning bucket is way bigger than somebody who's who plays golf, right? So their conditioning bucket is small. They still have a conditioning bucket, but the gas tank doesn't need to be as big. And then vice versa, right? So power for the golfer is way bigger than power for the endurance athlete, and you can change the size of the bucket. For, like, if you're in Cirque du Soleil, your mobility bucket better be big. But you don't need that same type of mobility in football. So everybody needs the four buckets. It's just what size of each bucket do you need? And then the last thing I want you to do, if you don't mind, is go into the 10% rule, because I don't think people remember that 10% of 50 is way different than 10% of 500.
Exactly. So, like, let's make it easy. If we're running, right, and I'm doing, 5 miles on the first day, right, I'm doing a 5-mile run, and I want to progress next week, a 10% jump would be what? A half a mile, right? I would go to 5.5 miles. That's much more manageable, right? Whereas jumping even 20% is a whole nother mile. That's a pretty significant increase, even though you're like, oh, it's just a mile. But now, if I go up to, let's say I'm doing, let's make the math easy. If I did 10 miles, right? Relative to that, even that's still a pretty big increase, right? You go add 1 mile to that. you might be able to manage that, right? But it's still fairly significant. Whereas if I get up to then running 20 miles as I'm getting closer to a marathon, right? Then I'm running 22 miles, right? And so you have to realize that those little gains, as you start to increase your bench press, right? Like I'm going to go bench press right after this actually. And say I'm benching 300, right? I'm not going to jump to 310. I'm going to jump.
You definitely don't bench 300.
I did 290 for three last week.
You mean 330?
Yes.
You mean 330? 330 would be a 10% jump.
And so, right, like if I'm going to make a 10% jump, 330 is massive, right? I'm going to go to 302 and a half. Right.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
As you get towards the margins of your intensity and the margins of your capacity and ability in anything, whether it's strength training or it's running related, you have to start to narrow the amount of jumps or increases that you make. Right. And so it's important to realize that you might need to take smaller jumps to be able to sustain those adaptations because you're getting closer to your ceiling. Everyone's going to have a genetic or physiological ceiling of where they're going to be able to get to. And we're going to be able to push it with training, but to push it as you get towards the top, the jumps have to be smaller or you're going to get outside of your ability to adapt. And that's typically when you get hurt, right? It's the old Hans Selye adaptation model, right? You fly too high, then that adaptation is not going to go the way that you want. You need to just touch. And that's why with beginners, right, you might be able to jump a little bit more because you haven't even figured out where their ceiling is, right? You ever teach a kid to bench press for the first time and then you're like, all right, do as many as you can in the last set. And they do like 27 reps with like 70 pounds of bar. And they were like, I'm like, okay, we could have, gone up more, but they told you it was heavy. And so, whereas like you get a more advanced lifter, it's like, nah, we're going up by 2.5 pounds. So you have to just realize that your jumps are going to be smaller as you get closer to your physiological ceiling as you go.
Right. So one of the examples that Mike used to use is if you have an athlete who's benching 100 and you have them go to 110, that's a 10% increase. That would be the same as me saying, oh, you bench 300, like let's go right to 330, right? That's a 10% increase. So you could never. So why do we, just because they're doing less weight or smaller weights doesn't mean we should be making drastic jumps like that, because if when you put it in a context, especially like you said with better lifters know not to do that. Then,
exactly.
Oh, I bench 300, let's go right to 330. Like, no. But if you have a kid who benches 100, you're like, let's try 110. Like, no, that's a huge increase. Let's try 102 and a half. We had all those 1 pound weights at MBSC, so you could go to 102. And so linear progression works really, really well for a very long time.
Yep.
All right. I don't have anything to add to that topic.
Let's talk about books.
All right. Let's go.
I got a good one that has nothing to do with the subject matter of the day today. And it's good because you have one that does, which is I like when we do this.
I do.
And so if you want to read something that really doesn't have anything to do with training at all, but it's just a fascinating story about the pharmaceutical industry, is called the book Bottle of Lies by Catherine Eben, the inside story of the genetic drug boom. Really interesting. It's a pretty big book. Yeah, that's right. I read it. It's about 400
I listened
pages.
to it.
And so she looks into one specific drug company. Like, as you know, at some point, once the patent runs out on name brand drugs, generic companies are able to start making them at a much lower cost, which could be very valuable. Obviously, as we know, the high cost of drugs for some people in this country especially can be crazy. So generic drugs are appealing. The problem with some of these generic drug companies is that their manufacturing and research is usually lackluster to do things at a lower cost. They want to have a larger margin, so they have to cut costs somewhere. And this looks into specifically the company called Ranbaxy, which made a number of genetic drugs based out of India. But they talk about a whole bunch of different instances where the FDA failed or did find issues with people, and how widespread kind of the fraud practices were in these drug companies. Really, really interesting. It's also going to make you worried to take any pharmaceuticals after you read it. But fascinating story. I read it very quickly, but very, very interesting read. A Bottle of Lies, I would recommend.
Makes you think how important it is to know where your resources are coming from.
Exactly.
It's a very good listen as well. It's well done on Audible. I listened to it. All right, so I mentioned the Brain That Changes Itself by Norman Deutsch, The Tale of Dueling Neurosurgeons by Sam Kahn. I also mentioned Spark by John Rady. My most fun version of those three books on connecting dots is Why Michael Couldn't Hit, and Other Tales of Neurology in Sports. So it's written by a physician who just likes sports and was a huge Michael Jordan fan. And he takes all these examples of athletes who had neurological disabilities but still ended up winning Olympic medals. He goes into the Muhammad Ali developing Parkinson's, a basketball player with Tourette's syndrome, and then he goes into why Michael Jordan sucked at baseball, because baseball's more of a neurological skill than it is an athletic endeavor. Mm-hmm. So you still, being an athlete helps, but because Michael didn't play baseball while he was growing up, he never developed the hand-eye coordination to pick up on a small object that quickly. And he goes into a whole neurology of how you hit a baseball and why Michael couldn't do it. That's how he opens the book. It's awesome. And then you won't be able to stop reading because of all the interesting athletes that I think there's 12 or 15 athletes that he goes through. That's by Harold Quallands. I can't pronounce that last name, but Michael Couldn't Hit. It's not a very popular book, doesn't have a lot of reviews, but it is very, very good.
Add it to the list. Well, that's an hour.
Boom.
Very good. Yeah, so what do we have coming up here, Brendan? Anything on your calendar?
All I have coming up is Perform Better Chicago in July. That is what I've got on the books. I don't have any CFSCs right now until the fall. I have many in the fall, but nothing in the summer at the moment.
Same. I got nothing.
What about you?
For good reason. I will not be teaching anything until Perform Better Providence in August, and I will not be doing a CFSC until I go to Croatia in the first weekend of September. But the rest of the team will be out and about. We actually have a lot this summer, level 1s and level 2s in Boston, level 1, level 2, Chicago, level 1, level 2, Reading, Pennsylvania, level 1, level 2 in New Jersey. We have level 1 back in Colorado, level 1 in Utah. So we have pretty much all over the place. We're going to be having events. Just go to the website, certifiedfsc.com, and you can see what we have coming up more specifically. And so, yeah, it's going to be a good summer.
Great summer. It's already kicking off. I got football, so that's taking over my life.
Well, I'm going to go to the gym and exercise.
It was a pleasure.
Goodbye.
I'm going to go walk the dog. See you later.
Bye.